They said a slave could never be trusted with anything of value, that someone born into bondage lacked the intelligence for strategy, the courage for daring action, the capability to lead. Yet, on a May night in 1862, in the heart of Confederate Charleston, one enslaved man would commandeer a heavily armed warship, sail it past multiple fortifications bristling with cannons, rescue his family from slavery, and deliver the vessel to the Union Navy. The Confederate officers thought it was impossible. Their entire system was built on the assumption that enslaved people were docile, simple, incapable of complex planning. They'd assigned enslaved men to crew their warships, never imagining those same men might use that trust against them. They went to sleep in their comfortable homes, confident that their human property would be there in the morning, obedient as always. But Robert Smalls had been planning for months, learning every signal, memorizing every password, studying the movements of every patrol boat. And when the moment came, he would execute one of the most audacious escapes in American history, stealing a Confederate warship right out from under their noses. This isn't just a story about escape. It's about a man who turned the Confederacy's own weapons against them, who became a war hero, a congressman, and a legend. And somehow, like so many stories of black excellence in American history, it's barely taught in schools. Let's fix that. Robert Smalls is born on April 5th, 1839, in a small cabin behind his enslaver's house in Beaufort, South Carolina. His mother, Lydia Polite, is enslaved by the McKee family. His father's identity is uncertain, possibly a white man, possibly McKee himself, but this uncertainty will hang over Robert's childhood like a shadow. From his first breath, Robert's life belongs to someone else. The McKee family owns him as surely as they own their furniture, their horses, their land. Under South Carolina law, he's property that can be bought, sold, traded, or inherited. He has no legal rights, no control over his future, no say in his own fate. But here's the thing about Robert Smalls. Even as a child, he's different. He watches, he listens, he learns. While other enslaved children accept their circumstances as unchangeable, Robert studies the world around him, filing away information, looking for angles, for opportunities. Beaufort is a small coastal town, one of the wealthiest communities in South Carolina. The plantations surrounding it produce Sea Island cotton, a premium crop that makes the white families of Beaufort obscenely rich. That wealth is built entirely on the labor of enslaved people who outnumber their enslavers nearly 10 to 1. The white families live in beautiful homes with wide porches and manicured gardens. They attend balls and dinner parties, discussing politics and literature. They send their children to the finest schools, and they do it all on the backs of people they consider less than human. Robert sees this hypocrisy from the beginning. He sees how the McKee family's wealth comes from his mother's work, from the work of dozens of other enslaved people. He sees how they justify it with religion and pseudoscience, creating elaborate theories about racial inferiority to excuse their brutality. But he also sees something else. He sees that the system has weaknesses, that the enslaved people who work in the big house hear everything, know everything, that the white families are dependent on the very people they oppress. That information is power, even for the powerless. His mother, Lydia, does something unusual when Robert is young. She makes sure he sees the worst of slavery. She takes him to the fields where enslaved people work from dawn until dark, their hands bleeding from picking cotton. She shows him the auction blocks in Charleston, where human beings are sold like livestock, families torn apart, children ripped from mothers' arms. She makes him witness a whipping. The sight of it, the sounds, the raw brutality, burns into his memory. Years later, Robert will explain why she did this. She wanted him to understand that the relatively comfortable life they had in Beaufort wasn't the whole picture. That slavery wasn't just hard work or unfair treatment. It was violence. It was inhumanity. It was a system designed to destroy the soul. She wanted him to never forget, never become comfortable, never stop wanting freedom. It works. Robert never accepts his condition, never internalizes the lies that slavery tells about inferiority and proper place. He carries a burning desire for freedom, a determination that will define his entire life. When he's 12 years old, in 1851, his world changes. Henry McKee, his enslaver, hires Robert out to work in Charleston. This is common practice. Enslavers would hire out skilled enslaved workers to others, pocketing the wages while the enslaved person received nothing, except sometimes a small allowance. For Robert, though, Charleston is a revelation. Imagine being 12 years old and seeing a real city for the first time. Charleston in 1851 is the crown jewel of the South, one of the wealthiest cities in America. It's a major port where ships from around the world dock, where cotton and rice are loaded onto vessels bound for Europe, where the slave trade, though officially illegal for importing from Africa, still thrives in domestic sales. The city is a contradiction. Beautiful architecture, cultured society, thriving commerce, all built on slavery. The harbor is full of ships, tall-masted schooners, steam-powered vessels, naval warships. Robert has never seen anything like it. He stands on the docks, watching these ships come and go, and something ignites in his imagination. Ships mean freedom. Ships can take you anywhere. Ships can take you away from slavery. He's assigned to work on the docks, doing manual labor, loading and unloading cargo. It's hard work, but Robert doesn't mind, because it gives him access to something invaluable: the waterfront. He learns about ships, not from books. There are laws against teaching enslaved people to read, but from observation and conversation. He learns how vessels are constructed, how they're piloted, how they navigate. He learns about tides and currents, about channels and shoals. He learns the signals ships use to communicate, the protocols of the harbor, the routines of the harbor pilots. The white workers and sailors talk freely around him, never thinking that this young black man might be absorbing every word, filing away information that could someday be used against them. They see him as just another slave, incapable of real understanding. They have no idea they're educating someone who will one day use that knowledge to strike a blow against the Confederacy. Robert also sees free black people in Charleston. Not many. South Carolina's laws make it extremely difficult for black people to gain or maintain freedom, but they exist. They work as craftsmen, as laborers, as sailors. They move through the city with a dignity that enslaved people can't show without risking punishment. Seeing them plants a seed in Robert's mind. Freedom is possible. Difficult. Dangerous. Unlikely. But possible. Over the years, Robert becomes intimately familiar with Charleston Harbor. He learns every fortification, every battery, every patrol route. He learns Fort Sumter, which guards the harbor entrance, and Fort Moultrie on Sullivan's Island. He learns Castle Pinckney and the various gun emplacements that protect the city. He doesn't know why he's learning all this, doesn't have a specific plan yet, but he's gathering intelligence the way some people collect stamps. Compulsively, thoroughly. In 1856, when he's 17, Robert meets Hannah Jones. She's enslaved by a different owner, working as a hotel maid in Charleston. They fall in love, a dangerous thing for enslaved people who have no control over their futures, who can be separated at any moment by the whims of their enslavers. But they marry anyway, in a ceremony that has no legal standing, but means everything to them. They start a family. Hannah gives birth to their first child, Elizabeth, in 1858, and a son, Robert Jr., follows. Now, Robert isn't just fighting for his own freedom. He's fighting for his family's future. Everything changes in April 1861 when Confederate forces fire on Fort Sumter, starting the Civil War. Charleston, as the birthplace of secession, is ground zero for Confederate enthusiasm. The white population is euphoric, certain that their rebellion will succeed, that their way of life built on slavery will be preserved and protected. For enslaved people, though, the war means something entirely different. It means hope. The Union, whatever its flaws, represents the possibility of freedom. If the North wins, slavery might end. It's not certain. President Lincoln hasn't committed to ending slavery yet. He's focused on preserving the Union, but the possibility exists. Robert, now 22 years old, is working on the CSS Planter, a Confederate transport and dispatch vessel. This isn't random luck. His years on the docks, his knowledge of ships and the harbor have made him valuable. The Confederates need skilled workers to crew their vessels, and enslaved men are cheaper than paying white sailors. They never consider that giving enslaved people access to Confederate military assets might be dangerous. The CSS Planter is a sidewheel steamer, 147 feet long, built originally as a civilian cotton transport but seized by Confederate authorities when the war started. She's been converted into an armed dispatch vessel, carrying messages, supplies, and troops between Charleston's various fortifications. She mounts several guns, making her a legitimate warship, though not particularly powerful by naval standards. But she's fast, maneuverable, and most importantly, she has access to the entire harbor. Robert works as a wheelman, essentially a pilot's assistant. He helps navigate the vessel, assists with docking, and maneuvering. It's a position of responsibility that would never be given to an enslaved person in normal circumstances, but the war has created labor shortages. The Confederacy needs Robert's skills more than it fears his potential for resistance. Over months of service, Robert learns everything about the planter. How she handles in different conditions, how much coal she burns, how far she can go on a full bunker. He learns her armament, her cargo capacity, her routines. More importantly, he learns the signals. Confederate vessels use specific signals to pass the various fortifications guarding Charleston Harbor. Flags during the day, whistle patterns at night. These signals identify friendly ships, telling the fort commanders not to fire. Without the correct signals, any vessel approaching the forts would be blown out of the water. Robert memorizes these signals, every flag combination, every whistle sequence. He watches the planter's captain, a white man named Charles Relia, and learns not just what the captain does, but how he does it. The way he stands, the way he holds his arms behind his back, the way he wears his distinctive straw hat. Details that will matter later. He also learns something else. The white officers and crew don't stay aboard at night. When the planter is docked at the wharf, usually at the foot of Charleston's South Atlantic Wharf, the white officers go home to their families. They leave the vessel in the care of the enslaved crew, trusting that these men won't dare try anything. Why would they? Escaping from a ship in Charleston Harbor is impossible. Where would you go? The harbor is surrounded by forts, patrolled by gunboats. Any escape attempt would result in the ship being sunk and everyone aboard killed. It's unthinkable, which is exactly why Robert thinks of it. Robert Smalls doesn't wake up one morning and decide to steal a Confederate warship. The plan develops slowly, growing from a vague possibility into a concrete strategy. He starts by talking carefully with the other enslaved crew members. 7 other men work aboard the planter. Alfred Gordine, John Smalls, no relation, Gabriel Turno, William Morrison, Abraham Jackson, Samuel Chisholm, and David Jones. These men have all suffered under slavery. They've all dreamed of freedom. But dreaming and acting are different things. Robert needs to know who can be trusted with something this dangerous. Imagine the risk he's taking just by talking about this. If any one of these men reports his planning to the Confederate authorities, Robert will be hanged. Slowly, probably after torture. His family will be punished, sold off to the worst plantations as an example. Talking about escape is itself a death sentence, but he watches these men, studies them, listens to how they talk when the white officers aren't around, gauges their anger, their courage, their desperation. One by one, he approaches them, not with a detailed plan at first, just testing. You ever think about what it would be like to be free? You ever wish you could just sail away from here? If there was a chance, would you take it? Their responses tell him everything he needs to know. Some are immediately interested, eager even. Others are terrified, and Robert backs off from them. He can't risk including anyone who might crack under pressure. But slowly, he builds his core group. 8 men total, counting himself. All experienced sailors. All with families they want to save. All willing to die, trying rather than live enslaved. The planning sessions happen in stolen moments. Whispered conversations while loading coal. Quick words exchanged while swabbing the deck. Fragments of a plan assembled piece by piece, so that no single conversation, if overheard, would reveal the whole scheme. The basic concept is insane in its audacity. Wait for a night when the white officers leave the planter docked with only the enslaved crew aboard. Steam out of the harbor as if on an authorized mission. Use the proper signals to pass each fortification. Once beyond the range of Confederate guns, alter course toward the Union blockade fleet waiting off the coast. Surrender the vessel to Union forces. Simple to describe. Nearly impossible to execute. 1,000 things could go wrong. The white officers might decide to stay aboard that particular night. The forts might not accept their signals and open fire. Confederate patrol boats might intercept them. The Union blockade might shoot first and ask questions later, not believing that a Confederate warship could be delivering itself. Any one of these failures means death, not just for the men aboard, but for their families. Which brings up the biggest complication: the families. Robert isn't leaving without Hannah and his children. None of the married men want to leave without their wives and children. But how do you smuggle multiple families, including small children who might cry at the wrong moment, aboard a Confederate warship without anyone noticing? It seems impossible. But Robert has an idea, a crazy idea that might just work. The night of May 12th, 1862, seems like any other night in Confederate Charleston. The city is quiet, confident. The war is going well from the Southern perspective. They've won several early battles. Their cause seems righteous to them. The possibility of defeat seems remote. Captain Relia and the other white officers of the CSS Planter have dinner in the city and head home, leaving the vessel in the care of the enslaved crew as always. It's a Monday night. Nothing special. Nothing to raise suspicions. But for Robert Smalls, this is the night. He's chosen it carefully. The moon is dark, making it harder for lookouts to spot details. The weather is clear, good for navigation. And most importantly, he knows the patrol schedules, knows there will be a window when they can move with minimal chance of immediate detection. At around 3 a.m., when the city is deepest in sleep, the plan begins. Robert and his crew do something they've never done before. They fire up the planter's boilers and prepare to cast off. They move quietly, efficiently. No shouting, no running. Everything calm and routine, because if anyone on the dock notices unusual activity, it's over before it starts. The planter carries a valuable cargo of weapons and ammunition being delivered to Confederate fortifications. 4 large guns intended for Fort Ripley and Fort Sumter, artillery shells, powder, supplies. Robert knows this makes the planter an even more valuable prize, but it also makes their escape more dangerous. If they're caught, the Confederacy won't just be angry about losing a ship. They'll be furious about losing these weapons. But first, the families. Robert carefully steals away from the wharf and makes his way to a prearranged meeting point. Hannah is there with Elizabeth and Robert Jr. Other wives are there with their children. 16 people total, counting the children. 16 people who need to be smuggled aboard a Confederate warship in the heart of Charleston Harbor without anyone noticing. They use a small boat to ferry the families to a rendezvous point near the planter. The children have been warned to stay absolutely silent. The women carry them carefully, hands ready to cover mouths if necessary. One cry, one shout from a toddler who doesn't understand what's happening, and Confederate soldiers will come running. The families are hidden below deck in the cargo areas. They crowd into spaces designed for supplies, not people. It's cramped, hot, difficult to breathe. But they stay quiet because they understand what's at stake. Everything. By 3:15 a.m., everyone is aboard. The planter's boilers are hot. Steam pressure is up. Robert Smalls, wearing Captain Relia's distinctive straw hat and standing in the captain's characteristic pose with his arms behind his back, gives the order to cast off. The lines are released. The paddle wheels begin to turn. The CSS Planter moves away from the dock, heading into Charleston Harbor, as if on an authorized mission. Imagine the tension in that moment. They're committed now. There's no turning back. If they're discovered, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They're on a Confederate warship in the middle of a Confederate harbor, surrounded by Confederate forts. The only way out is forward. The CSS Planter moves slowly through the harbor. Too fast would attract attention. Robert knows the routine. Dispatch vessels move at all hours, carrying messages and supplies between fortifications. Nothing unusual about a ship moving in the early morning darkness. But his heart is pounding so hard he can feel it in his throat. Every light he sees could be someone who's noticed something wrong. Every sound could be an alarm being raised. The first test comes at Fort Johnson on James Island. The Planter has to pass close to this fortification. If the lookouts there decide to challenge them, if anything seems wrong, the fort's guns will open fire at point-blank range. Robert stands at the wheel, wearing Captain Relay's hat, keeping his face in shadow. The distinctive straw hat is visible in the lamplight from the fort. The Planter's silhouette is familiar. She makes this run regularly. Robert gives the correct signal, the proper whistle pattern that identifies them as a friendly vessel on authorized business. Time stops. Everything depends on the next few seconds. If the fort doesn't accept the signal, if someone decides to take a closer look, it's over. The fort's watch acknowledges the signal. They let the Planter pass without challenge. Robert allows himself one breath of relief, but they're nowhere near safe. The harbor is full of obstacles, and the most dangerous one is still ahead. Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter sits on an artificial island in the harbor mouth, its guns commanding the main channel. Every vessel entering or leaving Charleston must pass under its cannons. The fort is heavily garrisoned, constantly alert. This is where the Civil War started, where Confederate forces fired the first shots. The soldiers there are experienced, vigilant. They've been expecting Union attacks, looking for any vessel that might be suspicious. As the Planter approaches Fort Sumter, Robert can see the walls looming in the darkness, can see the gun ports, knows that dozens of cannons are pointed at his ship. One wrong move, one suspicious detail, and those guns will fire. At this range, they can't miss. The Planter will be torn apart, everyone aboard killed. He maintains Captain Relay's posture, arms behind his back, the distinctive hat visible. He gives the signal. 2 long pulls and 1 short pull on the whistle. It's the correct sequence, the one that identifies the Planter as friendly. But something goes wrong. There's no immediate response from the fort. The Planter is getting close now, close enough that if the fort opens fire, there's no chance of survival. Robert's crew is frozen, waiting. The women and children below deck are silent, perhaps sensing the danger even though they can't see what's happening. Seconds stretch into an eternity. Has the signal changed? Has someone at the fort noticed that the figure in the captain's hat isn't quite right? Robert considers his options. They're all terrible. He can't turn back. That would definitely raise suspicion. He can't stop. That would leave them dead in the water under the fort's guns. He has to keep going. Maintain the routine. Act like everything is normal, even though his heart is trying to beat out of his chest. Finally, after what feels like an hour, but is probably less than a minute, the fort signals back. Permission to pass. The watch has accepted them as legitimate. The Planter steams past Fort Sumter, moving into the outer harbor. They're beyond the range of the fort's guns now, but they're not free yet, not by a long shot. Once past Fort Sumter, the Planter enters the outer harbor, but this is still Confederate-controlled water. There are patrol boats, other vessels, multiple ways they could still be stopped, and Robert knows that as soon as morning comes, as soon as Captain Relia arrives at the dock and finds his ship missing, the alarm will be raised. Every Confederate vessel in the area will be hunting for them. Time is critical. They need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Charleston before daylight exposes them. Robert changes course. Up until now, they've been following the routes the Planter normally takes, heading toward the outer fortifications, as if delivering supplies. But now he turns the vessel toward the open sea, toward the Union blockade. The crew knows what this means. They're committed now. If they're caught after this course change, there's no possible explanation except what they're actually doing. It's treason from the Confederate perspective. It's an act of war. It's a death sentence for everyone aboard. The Planter's steam engine pounds away, driving them forward. The side wheels churn through the dark water. Every man aboard is scanning the horizon, looking for Confederate patrol boats, listening for sounds of pursuit. The women and children below deck must be terrified, hearing the tension in the men's voices, feeling the vibration of the engine, knowing their lives depend on the next few hours going perfectly. As dawn begins to break on May 13th, Robert faces a new problem: the Confederate flag. The Planter is still flying Confederate colors, which help them pass the forts, but will get them blown out of the water by the Union blockade. He needs to signal their intentions somehow, needs to make it clear they're not attacking, but surrendering. But he hasn't brought a white flag, the universal signal of surrender. In the rush and tension of planning, this detail was overlooked. For a moment, panic threatens. They're approaching the Union fleet, still flying Confederate colors, piloting what appears to be a Confederate warship. The Union vessels will open fire any second. They have to do something. Hannah, his wife, has an idea. She finds a white sheet, one of the few pieces of fabric aboard that could serve the purpose. It's not a proper flag, but it'll have to do. Robert orders the Confederate flag struck, and the white sheet raised in its place. It's a makeshift surrender flag, barely visible in the early morning light, but it's something. The USS Onward, part of the Union blockading squadron, spots the approaching vessel. At first, they prepare for combat. A Confederate warship is bearing down on them. Battle stations are called. Guns are trained on the Planter. The Union sailors are ready to fire. But then someone notices the white flag. It's confusing. Confederate vessels don't surrender. They don't approach Union ships flying white flags. What's happening? The Onward's captain, John Frederick Nichols, is cautious. This could be a trick, some kind of Confederate ruse. Maybe the vessel is packed with explosives, meant to ram them and detonate. Maybe it's a diversion for a larger attack. He orders his gunners to keep the Planter in their sights, but holds fire, waiting to see what happens. The Planter comes alongside the Onward, and Robert Smalls, still wearing Captain Relay's straw hat, calls out across the water. His voice is strong, clear, carrying across the gap between the vessels. "Good morning, sir. I've brought you some of the old United States guns, sir." It's a masterful line, delivered with confidence, with a touch of humor, acknowledging exactly what he's done. He's brought them guns. Confederate guns that were meant to kill Union soldiers. He's delivered a Confederate warship to the Union Navy. And he's done it as a black man who was enslaved just hours ago. The Union sailors are stunned. They stare in disbelief as Robert explains the situation. How he and his crew seized the vessel. How they passed the Confederate forts. How they brought their families aboard. How they've delivered the Planter and its cargo of weapons to the Union. Captain Nichols has to verify the story, of course. He boards the Planter, inspects the vessel, questions Robert and his crew, but the evidence is overwhelming. This is the CSS Planter, a known Confederate vessel. She's loaded with Confederate weapons and ammunition. Her crew consists of enslaved men who've just risked everything for freedom, and they've delivered it all to the Union. It's one of the most audacious acts of the entire Civil War, and it's only just beginning to sink in what Robert Smalls has accomplished. News of the Planter's capture spreads like wildfire. In the North, Robert Smalls becomes an instant hero. Newspapers run front-page stories about the enslaved pilot who stole a Confederate warship. His photograph appears in publications across the Union. People who've never given much thought to the capabilities of black people are forced to reconsider their assumptions. Here's a man who was enslaved, supposedly inferior, supposedly incapable of complex thought or action, and he's just outsmarted the entire Confederate military in Charleston. He planned and executed an operation that most military officers would consider nearly impossible. He navigated past multiple fortifications in the dark. He fooled experienced sentries. He brought his entire family to freedom and delivered valuable military assets to the Union. Think about what this means. The entire Southern system is built on the assumption that enslaved people are incapable of this kind of initiative, this level of intelligence. The Confederacy has assigned enslaved men to crew their warships, work in their fortifications, build their defenses, because they believe these men lack the ability to turn that knowledge against them. Robert Smalls has just proven that assumption catastrophically wrong. In the South, the response is rage and humiliation. The Confederate authorities in Charleston are furious. How did an enslaved crew steal a warship from the heart of their most heavily defended harbor? Heads roll. Officers are reprimanded. Security is tightened, but the damage is done. Every enslaved person in the South now knows that Robert Smalls escaped, that he brought his family to freedom, that he struck a blow against the Confederacy. The story spreads through the slave quarters, whispered in the fields, shared in the kitchens, and it plants a seed of possibility in thousands of minds. The Union military is trying to figure out what to do with Robert and his men. They're technically contraband, the legal term the Union uses for escaped slaves. They're not free citizens, not exactly. The Emancipation Proclamation won't come until January 1863, still 8 months away. But they've delivered valuable military intelligence and a valuable vessel. The Planter herself is worth a fortune. The weapons aboard are desperately needed, and Robert Smalls has knowledge that could be invaluable. He knows Charleston Harbor better than anyone. He knows the fortifications, the gun placements, the patrol routes, the signals. He's lived and worked there his entire life. He's a walking intelligence asset. Congress eventually passes a special act awarding prize money for the capture of the Planter. Robert receives $1,500, a significant sum in 1862. His crew members receive smaller amounts based on their ranks. It's not full compensation for the value of the vessel and cargo, which would make them wealthy, but it's more money than any of them have ever had. More importantly, it's recognition. Official recognition from the United States government that what they did mattered. But Robert Smalls isn't content to just escape and collect his prize money. He wants to do more. He wants to fight. He knows the war is about slavery now, whatever the politicians say. If the Union wins, slavery ends. If the Confederacy wins, he and his family will be enslaved again, hunted down and punished for their escape. There's no middle ground, so he volunteers his services to the Union Navy. The Union Navy commissions Robert Smalls as a civilian pilot. He's assigned to guide Union vessels through the treacherous waters around Charleston and the South Carolina coast. These waters are dangerous, even in peacetime. Sandbars, shallow channels, tidal currents that can ground a ship or drive it onto rocks. Add Confederate defenses, and it becomes a nightmare for Union commanders who don't know the local waters. But Robert knows them, knows every channel, every depth, every safe passage. He guides Union warships through waters where Confederate pilots insist no vessel can navigate. He leads raids against Confederate positions, using his intimate knowledge of the coastline to find approaches no one else knows about. He becomes invaluable to the Union operations along the South Carolina coast. And he does it all while facing prejudice and doubt from some Union officers who can't quite believe that a black man, especially one who was enslaved until recently, could possess this level of skill and knowledge. There are officers who refuse to trust his advice, who second-guess his navigation, who insist on checking his work as if he might be leading them into disaster. Robert handles this with remarkable patience and professionalism. He doesn't argue. He simply proves himself correct, again and again, until even the skeptics have to acknowledge his abilities. In December 1863, Robert is aboard the CSS Planter, yes, the same vessel he stole from the Confederates, now commissioned into Union service. The Planter is engaged in a mission when the captain is killed in action. The white commanding officer is killed, and suddenly there's chaos. Who takes command? The vessel is under fire. Decisions need to be made immediately. Robert Smalls steps up. He takes the wheel, issues orders, maneuvers the Planter out of danger while continuing to engage the Confederate positions. He does exactly what needs to be done, displaying leadership and tactical skill under the most intense pressure imaginable. After this action, Robert is officially promoted to captain of the CSS Planter. Think about this. A man who was enslaved just 2 years earlier is now commanding a Union warship, the same warship he stole from the Confederacy. It's an unprecedented situation. The Union Navy has never had a black captain before. There are white officers with years of experience, academy training, family connections, who don't have their own commands. And Robert Smalls, self-taught, educated through observation and experience, is now Captain Smalls. The significance goes beyond one man's achievement. Every time Robert Smalls sails the Planter into action, every time he successfully completes a mission, every time he demonstrates his competence and leadership, he's challenging the racial assumptions of the entire nation. He's proving that black men can lead, can command, can perform at the highest levels when given the opportunity. When the Civil War ends in 1865, Robert Smalls is 26 years old. He's served with distinction throughout the conflict. He's commanded a Union warship. He's earned the respect of many Union officers, though others remain skeptical that a black man could truly be as capable as he's proven himself to be. He could retire now, live quietly on his prize money and his wartime earnings. But Robert Smalls has bigger plans. The war has ended slavery, but the fight for black rights is just beginning. The South is in ruins, its economy destroyed, its social structure upended. 4 million formerly enslaved people are suddenly free. But free to do what? They own nothing. Most can't read or write. They have no money, no property, no education. The white South is determined to maintain white supremacy through other means if slavery itself is outlawed. And the federal government is trying to figure out how to rebuild the South while guaranteeing rights to the newly freed slaves. This period, called Reconstruction, is chaotic and violent. The Ku Klux Klan and similar terrorist organizations emerge, using violence and intimidation to prevent black political participation. White Southerners pass black codes, laws designed to restrict black freedom and force formerly enslaved people back into conditions as close to slavery as possible. And in Washington, politicians argue about what Reconstruction should look like, how far the federal government should go in protecting black rights, how long Union troops should occupy the South. Robert Smalls returns to Beaufort, South Carolina, to the town where he was born into slavery, and he does something remarkable. He buys the house where he was enslaved. The McKee house, where his mother worked, where he spent his childhood, is for sale. The McKee family has fallen on hard times, like much of the Southern aristocracy after the war. Robert has money now, savings from his wartime service and his prize money. He purchases the house for $600 at a tax sale in 1863, though the actual transfer of ownership comes later. There's something deeply symbolic about this. The slave returning as the owner, the property becoming the proprietor. Robert doesn't buy the house just as a trophy or revenge. He buys it because his mother still lives there. She's old now, and he wants her to live out her remaining years in comfort, in the house where she once served, but now as part of a family that owns it. When Lydia Polite dies, she dies as a free woman in a house owned by her son. Robert even allows the elderly Mrs. McKee, the widow of his former enslaver, to continue living in a room in the house after her husband's death. He doesn't evict her, doesn't take revenge. He treats her with dignity and respect, providing her a place to live when she has nowhere else to go. It's a level of grace that few people could muster towards someone who once claimed to own them. But Robert Smalls understands something profound. The fight isn't against individual white people. It's against a system. Mrs. McKee, elderly and impoverished, isn't the enemy. The system that allowed her family to own human beings is the enemy. Robert isn't content with personal success. He wants to build something larger. He wants to help create a new South where black people have real freedom, real opportunities, real political power. So he enters politics. In 1868, just 3 years after the war ends, Robert is elected as a delegate to the South Carolina Constitutional Convention. This convention is tasked with writing a new state constitution, one that complies with federal Reconstruction requirements and guarantees rights to black citizens. It's a remarkable gathering. Former slaves sit alongside former slaveholders. Black delegates, many of whom couldn't legally learn to read just a few years earlier, debate constitutional principles with white lawyers and planters. Robert is one of the most effective delegates. He argues passionately for public education, something South Carolina has never had. The state's white elite educated their children privately or sent them to academies in Charleston and Columbia. Poor whites received little education, and enslaved people received none. Education for slaves was actually illegal. Robert pushes for a system of free public schools open to all children, black and white. He argues that education is the foundation of citizenship, that people can't exercise their rights effectively if they can't read the laws or understand the issues. He also fights for economic rights. He understands that freedom without economic opportunity is hollow. What good is being legally free if you're forced into sharecropping arrangements that are barely distinguishable from slavery? If you're paid starvation wages for backbreaking work? If you can't own property or start a business? Robert advocates for land redistribution, for programs to help formerly enslaved people acquire property and become economically independent. These efforts are only partially successful. The resistance from white Southerners is intense, and the federal government's commitment to Reconstruction is already beginning to waver. In 1870, Robert is elected to the South Carolina House of Representatives. In 1874, he's elected to the South Carolina Senate, and in 1875, he's elected to the United States House of Representatives, Congressman Robert Smalls. The man who was enslaved until age 23 is now a member of Congress at age 36, representing the district that includes Beaufort, the town where he was born into bondage. Walking into the Capitol building as a congressman must have been surreal for Robert. This building was constructed partially by enslaved labor. The very stones of the Capitol were laid by people in chains. And now, just a decade after emancipation, a formerly enslaved man walks its halls as a legislator. The symbolism isn't lost on Robert or on anyone else. For black Americans across the country, Robert Smalls is proof of what's possible. For white supremacists, he's a nightmare made real. Their entire worldview is based on black inferiority, and here's a black man operating at the highest levels of government. Robert serves in Congress during a critical period. Reconstruction is under assault. Southern whites are using every tool available, legal and illegal, to restore white supremacy. The KKK terrorizes black voters, murdering those who try to exercise their rights. State governments pass increasingly restrictive laws. White employers refuse to hire black workers who vote Republican, and Northern support for Reconstruction is declining. White Northerners are tired of the conflict, ready to move on, willing to sacrifice black rights for sectional peace. In Congress, Robert fights for enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which guarantee equal protection under law and prohibit racial discrimination in voting. He gives speeches on the House floor detailing the violence and intimidation black Southerners face. He presents evidence of election fraud, of black voters being turned away from polls, of ballot boxes being stuffed or destroyed. He argues passionately for continued federal protection, for keeping Union troops in the South until black rights are truly secure. But the political winds are shifting. The 1876 presidential election is contested, and the resolution involves a compromise. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president in exchange for agreeing to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. It's a betrayal of black Southerners, leaving them at the mercy of white supremacist state governments without federal protection. Robert sees it coming and fights against it, but he can't stop it. After the end of Reconstruction, conditions for black Southerners deteriorate rapidly. State governments pass Jim Crow laws, creating a system of legal segregation. Black voters are systematically disenfranchised through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence. The gains of Reconstruction are rolled back. Black political power, which had been growing, is crushed. Within a generation, the South becomes a rigid racial caste system, separate and profoundly unequal. Robert continues fighting. He serves 5 terms in Congress, though not consecutively. He's voted out in some elections, voted back in others, as the political situation in South Carolina shifts. White Democrats use fraud, intimidation, and violence to reduce black voting, but Beaufort's large black population keeps returning Robert to office when they can. He uses his position to advocate for his constituents. He secures federal funding for harbor improvements in Beaufort and Charleston. He fights for pensions for black Union veterans. He introduces bills to improve education and economic opportunities. He also faces constant racism in Congress. Some white congressmen refuse to acknowledge him. Others make openly racist remarks during debates. There are challenges to his legitimacy. Arguments that black men shouldn't be allowed in Congress. Efforts to unseat him on technicalities. Robert handles it with remarkable dignity. He doesn't respond to insults with insults. He doesn't let racism distract him from his work. He simply continues representing his constituents, continues fighting for justice, continues proving through his conduct that he belongs. There's an incident that captures Robert's character during this period. In 1895, South Carolina holds a constitutional convention, this time not to expand rights, but to restrict them. The purpose is to disenfranchise black voters while technically complying with the 15th Amendment's prohibition on racial discrimination in voting. It's a convention designed to destroy black political power. Robert is elected as a delegate, one of only 6 black delegates in a convention dominated by white supremacists. The outcome is predetermined. The convention will create a new constitution that effectively prevents black people from voting. But Robert attends anyway. He speaks anyway. He argues against every discriminatory provision, knowing he'll lose every vote. At one point, he gives a speech that becomes famous. He addresses the white delegates directly, reminding them of his service to South Carolina, of black Carolinians' service during the Civil War and after. "My race needs no special defense," he says, "for the past history of them in this country proves them to be equal of any people anywhere. All they need is an equal chance in the battle of life." It's a powerful statement, but it doesn't change the outcome. The 1895 South Carolina Constitution includes provisions specifically designed to prevent black voting. Literacy tests administered by white registrars who pass illiterate whites and fail literate blacks. Property requirements that most black Carolinians can't meet. Understanding clauses that require explaining sections of the Constitution to the satisfaction of white officials. These provisions work exactly as intended. Black voting in South Carolina drops from nearly 70% of eligible black men to almost zero within a few years. Robert Smalls lives long enough to see almost all of Reconstruction's gains reversed. The man who stole a Confederate warship, who commanded a Union vessel, who served in Congress, watches as Jim Crow takes hold, watches as the rights he fought for are stripped away, watches as white supremacy reasserts itself through law rather than just violence. It must have been heartbreaking to come so close to real equality, to see it within reach during Reconstruction, and then watch it slip away. To know that the next generation of black Southerners will grow up in a system almost as oppressive as slavery, just with different legal mechanisms. But Robert doesn't become bitter. He doesn't give up. He continues fighting in whatever ways he can. When he can't serve in Congress anymore because black voting has been suppressed, he works in other capacities. He serves as customs collector for the Port of Beaufort, a federal appointment that provides income and some continued influence. He works to improve schools for black children. He mentors young black leaders. He keeps telling his story, keeps reminding people of what black people accomplished during and after the Civil War, keeps insisting that the current system of oppression is wrong and temporary. He remains active in Republican Party politics in South Carolina, even as the party becomes less and less relevant in the increasingly Democratic-dominated state. He attends party conventions, makes speeches, encourages black Carolinians not to give up on political participation even when the system is rigged against them. He lives to see the early 20th century, sees the automobile replace the horse, sees electricity come to South Carolina cities, sees the world changing in dramatic ways. But he also sees racial oppression becoming more entrenched, not less. The optimism of Reconstruction has given way to the reality of Jim Crow. Robert Smalls dies on February 23, 1915, at the age of 75. He's been in declining health for several years, suffering from diabetes and other ailments. He dies in the house he bought, the McKee House, surrounded by family. His funeral is one of the largest ever held in Beaufort. Thousands attend, black and white, though probably sitting in separate sections because South Carolina is fully segregated by 1915. The eulogies celebrate his remarkable life, his courage, his service. The newspapers run obituaries acknowledging his achievements. But there's also a note of sadness in the coverage, an acknowledgement that the world Robert fought to create, a world of racial equality and justice, hasn't come to pass. And then, like so many black heroes, his story begins to fade from popular memory. The Jim Crow South doesn't want to remember black achievement. White supremacy requires believing that black people are inferior, incapable of the kind of brilliance and courage Robert displayed. So his story is downplayed, minimized, eventually largely forgotten outside of black communities and local South Carolina history. Textbooks that cover the Civil War mention dramatic battles, famous generals, Lincoln's leadership. They rarely mention Robert Smalls. The story of him stealing the planter is too good, too inspiring, too challenging to racist narratives. So it's left out. Children growing up in America, black and white, don't learn about the man who commandeered a Confederate warship. Don't learn about his service in Congress. Don't learn about his lifelong fight for justice. For decades, Robert Smalls exists primarily in footnotes. Specialist historians know about him. The black community in Beaufort remembers him. But to most Americans, even educated Americans, his name means nothing. This erasure is systematic and deliberate. The narrative of the Civil War and Reconstruction that dominates American education for most of the 20th century is largely written from a Southern white perspective. It minimizes slavery's horrors, romanticizes the Confederacy, portrays Reconstruction as a mistake, and depicts black political participation as corrupt and incompetent. In this narrative, there's no room for Robert Smalls. His story doesn't fit. How do you claim black people weren't ready for freedom when one of them stole a warship and delivered it to the Union? How do you argue that black politicians during Reconstruction were uniformly corrupt when Robert Smalls served with distinction? How do you maintain that the end of Reconstruction was necessary because black people couldn't govern when Robert Smalls successfully represented his district in Congress for multiple terms? So the solution is simple. Don't tell his story. Don't teach it in schools. Don't include it in textbooks. Let it fade. Focus instead on stories that support the preferred narrative. Stories of white heroes, white generals, white politicians. Even when discussing black Americans' role in the Civil War, focus on their service as soldiers following white officers, not on their independent initiative and leadership. This erasure has consequences. Generations of Americans grow up without knowing this history. White Americans don't learn about black achievement, black courage, black intelligence. So stereotypes and prejudices persist unchallenged. Black Americans don't learn about their own history of resistance and accomplishment, so they're denied role models and inspiration. The actual history of Reconstruction, of black political participation, of the violent overthrow of multiracial democracy in the South, is hidden. And without understanding that history, it's impossible to fully understand the present. But history has a way of resurfacing. Starting in the 1960s, driven by the Civil Rights Movement and the growing field of African American history, scholars begin recovering these lost stories. They dig through archives, military records, congressional documents, old newspapers. They interview elderly people whose grandparents remembered Reconstruction. They piece together what actually happened during those crucial years after the Civil War. And they rediscover Robert Smalls. Historian Willie Lee Rose writes about him. Other scholars follow. Gradually, his story begins to be told again, not just in academic papers, but in books for general readers, in documentaries, in museum exhibits. In 2004, the U.S. Navy names a ship after him, the USNS Robert Smalls. It's the first U.S. Navy ship named for a black sailor from the Civil War era. In Beaufort, there are monuments to him now, schools bearing his name. annual celebrations of his achievements. The house where he was enslaved and later owned is a museum. But even with this recovery, Robert Smalls remains far less known than he should be. Ask random Americans to name Civil War heroes, and you'll hear Grant, Lee, Lincoln, maybe Sherman, or Jackson. How many will say Robert Smalls? Ask people to name black heroes from the Civil War era, and you'll hear Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, maybe Sojourner Truth, all deserving of their fame, but Robert Smalls belongs in that company. The story of Robert Smalls forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about whose stories get told and why. It forces us to ask what else we've been not taught, what other heroes have been erased, what other achievements have been minimized or ignored because they don't fit preferred narratives. And it challenges us to consider how different our understanding of American history would be if we taught the full story. If we included the voices and experiences and achievements of all Americans, not just the ones who held power. So, what does Robert Smalls teach us? What can we learn from a man who was enslaved until age 23 and went on to command a warship and serve in Congress? First, there's the lesson about the power of knowledge. Robert didn't escape slavery through physical strength or lucky circumstances. He escaped through knowledge, years of watching, listening, learning, memorizing signals and patrol routes, understanding how the system worked well enough to exploit its weaknesses. Knowledge was his weapon, and he sharpened it for years before using it. This has profound implications. The slaveholders knew that knowledge was dangerous. That's why teaching enslaved people to read was illegal. That's why they tried to keep enslaved people ignorant, uneducated, uninformed. They understood that knowledge is power, that an educated enslaved population would be impossible to control. Robert Smalls proved them right. The knowledge he gained, even without formal education, was enough to strike a devastating blow against the Confederacy. Second, there's the lesson about courage and calculated risk. Stealing the Planter wasn't reckless. Robert didn't just wake up one morning and decide to steal a ship on a whim. He planned carefully, prepared thoroughly, chose his moments strategically. But planning alone wasn't enough. At some point, he had to act, had to take the risk, had to commit to a course of action that could get everyone he loved killed. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is acting despite fear when the stakes demand it. Robert was surely terrified as he steamed the Planter past Fort Sumter, but he did it anyway, because the alternative, living in slavery, was worse than the risk of death. Third, there's the lesson about the dignity of resistance. Robert could have accepted his condition. Many people did, not because they were weak or complicit, but because resistance seemed hopeless, the costs too high, the chances of success too low. But Robert refused to accept slavery, refused to internalize the lies about black inferiority, refused to live as property when he could fight to live as a human being. That refusal to accept injustice, that insistence on human dignity, is fundamentally important. It's what drives all successful resistance movements. Fourth, there's the lesson about proving doubters wrong through action. Robert faced skepticism constantly, as an enslaved person, from those who assumed he was incapable of complex planning. As an escaped slave, from Union officers who questioned whether he could really be trusted to pilot their ships. As a black politician, from those who insisted black people couldn't govern. He didn't waste energy arguing with skeptics. He just kept proving them wrong, kept demonstrating competence, integrity, intelligence, until even the doubters had to acknowledge reality. Fifth, there's the profound lesson about grace under pressure. Robert had every reason to be angry, every reason to be bitter about what slavery took from him, about the racism he faced even after emancipation, about watching Reconstruction's promise betrayed, and Jim Crow established. But bitterness didn't define him. He could show grace to Mrs. McKee, his former enslaver's widow. He could work within systems that were biased against him. He could focus on building rather than destroying, on creating opportunities for others rather than seeking revenge for past wrongs. That doesn't mean he wasn't angry, doesn't mean he accepted injustice. He fought racism his entire life, challenged inequality, demanded rights, but he did it in a way that was strategic, constructive, focused on creating the future he wanted, rather than just punishing the people who'd created the past he suffered through. Finally, there's the lesson about the long view. Robert's fight didn't end with his escape, didn't end when the war ended, didn't end when Reconstruction came, or when it was betrayed. He kept fighting for justice until he died. He understood that the struggle was larger than one lifetime, that he might not see the world he was fighting for, but that the fight still mattered. This perspective is crucial. Social change is slow. Progress isn't linear. There are advances and retreats. Robert witnessed this firsthand. The tremendous progress of Reconstruction, followed by the terrible regression of Jim Crow. He could have given up, declared the fight lost. Instead, he kept working, kept teaching, kept insisting that justice would eventually prevail, even if he didn't live to see it. Robert Smalls' story raises uncomfortable questions that we still need to grapple with. If an enslaved man could display this level of intelligence, courage, and leadership, what does that say about the millions of other enslaved people who never got the chance to show what they could do? How much human potential was wasted? How much genius was lost? How much could have been achieved if those people had been free? And what about after emancipation? Robert succeeded despite enormous obstacles. He had to overcome not just poverty and lack of formal education, but active opposition, systematic racism, laws designed to keep him down. How much more could he have achieved without those obstacles? And how many other Black Americans, just as talented, just as capable, never got even the limited chances Robert had? The story also forces us to examine how history gets written and taught. Why was Robert Smalls' story largely erased for decades? Why are there Confederate monuments in towns across the South, but until recently, almost no monuments to Black heroes of the same era? Why do textbooks spend pages on Confederate generals, but barely mention Black resistance and achievement? These aren't accidents. They're choices about whose stories matter, whose heroes deserve remembering, whose version of history becomes the official narrative. And it makes us ask what we're missing now. If the story of Robert Smalls could be buried for decades, what other stories are we not hearing? What achievements are being minimized? What perspectives are being excluded from our understanding of both history and the present? Every time someone says, "I never learned about this in school," it should prompt the question, what else wasn't taught, and why? Robert Smalls didn't just escape slavery. He didn't just steal a ship. He didn't just serve in Congress. He proved something that the entire Confederate system was designed to deny. He proved that the claimed inferiority of Black people was a lie. Every action he took, every achievement he earned, was evidence against the ideology of white supremacy. The slaveholders had said Black people were incapable of initiative. Robert planned and executed one of the war's most daring operations. They'd said Black people lacked intelligence. Robert outsmarted experienced military commanders and navigated complex political systems. They'd said Black people couldn't be trusted with responsibility. Robert commanded a warship and represented his constituents faithfully in Congress. His life was a refutation of racism delivered through action rather than argument. And that's part of why his story was suppressed. It's too dangerous to white supremacy. You can't teach children about Robert Smalls and simultaneously teach them that Black people are inferior. The two narratives are incompatible. So for decades, the choice was made to bury his story rather than confront the contradictions it created. But stories like this have a resilience to them. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually. Historians recover it, descendants preserve it, and eventually it reaches new generations who need to hear it. Young Black Americans today learning about Robert Smalls see proof that their ancestors were brilliant, brave, capable. That Black excellence isn't new, isn't a modern phenomenon. That for as long as there's been oppression, there's been resistance. That their history includes not just suffering, but also triumph. Young white Americans learning about Robert Smalls have to confront the fact that the racism they've inherited, the stereotypes they've absorbed, are built on lies. That the sanitized version of American history they might have learned in school left out crucial parts of the story. That understanding America's past and present requires including voices and experiences that have been systematically excluded. And all young Americans learning this story see something important. They see that one person can make a difference. That courage matters. That knowledge is power. That systems that seem unbeatable can be defeated through intelligence, planning, and daring action. There's something deeply American about Robert Smalls' story, even though much of America tried to forget it. The idea that anyone, regardless of their birth or background, can rise through talent and effort. That's supposed to be the American promise, right? But for most of American history, that promise explicitly excluded black people. They were enslaved, then segregated, then discriminated against. The system was designed to prevent exactly what Robert Smalls achieved. His success was despite America, not because of it. Despite slavery, despite racism, despite laws designed to keep him down. He succeeded by being undeniably excellent, by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose, by seizing opportunities when they appeared and creating them when they didn't. And in doing so, he expanded what America could be. Every black person who served in Congress after him walked a path he helped clear. Every black officer who commanded a ship followed in his wake. Every person who believes in racial equality can point to Robert Smalls as proof that the belief is justified. So, what do we owe Robert Smalls? First, we owe him memory. We owe it to him and to ourselves to tell his story, to teach it in schools, to make sure it doesn't get buried again. Not as a feel-good story about overcoming obstacles, though it is that, but as a crucial part of American history that helps us understand the Civil War, Reconstruction, the fight for civil rights, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice. We owe him honesty about what happened after his death, about how the world he fought to create was deliberately destroyed, about how white supremacy reasserted itself, about how the promise of Reconstruction was betrayed. We can celebrate his achievements while acknowledging that the fight he began is still ongoing, that the justice he pursued remains incomplete. We owe him action. Learning about historical injustice is worthless if it doesn't inspire us to confront present injustice. Robert Smalls' story should make us ask, what systems of oppression exist today? What lies are we being told about certain groups of people? Whose stories are being suppressed or erased? And what are we going to do about it? We owe him the commitment to finish what he started, to keep fighting for the equal justice he believed in, to resist the forces that want to turn back progress, to build the multiracial democracy that existed briefly during Reconstruction and was violently overthrown, to create a society where everyone actually has equal opportunity, not just in theory, but in practice. And we owe him recognition as one of the great American heroes. Not a black hero, qualified and separated. Just an American hero. Period. Someone whose courage, intelligence, and integrity should be celebrated regardless of race. Someone whose life should be studied in every American history class, whose name should be as familiar as any other Civil War figure, whose achievements should be a point of national pride. But it's also important to remember that Robert Smalls was human, not just a symbol. He was a man who loved his family, who felt fear and doubt, who made mistakes, who had flaws. He wasn't perfect. He was a politician who sometimes had to make compromises. He was a man operating in impossibly difficult circumstances, trying to navigate systems designed to exclude him, trying to protect his community while facing violence and intimidation. We don't dishonor him by acknowledging his humanity. We honor him by recognizing that he did extraordinary things despite being an ordinary person in many ways. He wasn't born with superpowers. He didn't have advantages that others lacked. What he had was intelligence, which many people have, courage, which many people possess, a refusal to accept injustice, which many people feel. What made him extraordinary was that he acted on these qualities, that he used his intelligence to plan an escape, that he found the courage to execute it, that he channeled his refusal to accept injustice into decades of political work. This is actually more inspiring than if he were some unique genius unlike anyone else, because it means that the capacity for this kind of heroism exists in many people. That extraordinary achievements are possible for ordinary individuals who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and rise to meet them. That you don't have to be born special to do something that matters. You just have to be willing to try. Let's count what Robert Smalls accomplished. He liberated himself and 16 other people from slavery, including his entire family. He delivered a Confederate warship and its weapons to the Union, weakening the Confederacy and strengthening the Union cause. He served with distinction as a Union pilot and ship captain, contributing to multiple military operations. He provided invaluable intelligence about Confederate defenses. He became a powerful symbol of black capability, challenging racist assumptions. He served in the South Carolina legislature and the U.S. Congress, representing his constituents and fighting for civil rights. He helped write South Carolina's Reconstruction Constitution. He advocated for public education, economic opportunity, and equal rights. He lived long enough to see slavery ended, though not long enough to see true equality achieved. That's a life that mattered. That's a legacy that endures. And comparing his achievements to what he had to overcome makes them all the more remarkable. He started with nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because he started as property, with the full weight of society insisting he was inferior, incapable, less than human. And from that starting point, through intelligence, courage, and unwavering determination, he became a war hero, a political leader, a symbol of possibility. If that's not the American story at its best, what is? Robert Smalls died in 1915, but his story continues. Every time someone learns about him and is inspired, every time his life is used as an example in the fight for justice, every time his name is invoked to prove that black Americans have always been capable of extraordinary achievement, the story continues in Beaufort, where his house still stands, where people still talk about him with pride, where children learn about the man who was born enslaved in their town and went on to command a warship and serve in Congress. It continues in the U.S. Navy on the USNS Robert Smalls, carrying his name across the oceans he once navigated under very different circumstances. It continues in history books that are finally being corrected, in curriculums that are finally being expanded, in museums that are finally telling a fuller version of American history. It continues every time someone hears his story and thinks, I never learned about this. What else don't I know? Because that question, that recognition that there are gaps in our knowledge, that we've been taught an incomplete history, is the beginning of a deeper understanding. The story continues in every person who faces a system designed to keep them down and refuses to accept it. Who looks for the weaknesses in that system, the opportunities to resist, the chances to break free? Who understands that the fight for justice requires intelligence and courage and persistence? Who knows that one person's action can ripple out in ways that change the world? Robert Smalls couldn't have known, as he steamed the Planter past Fort Sumter in the darkness, how far his impact would reach. He was focused on the immediate goal, freedom for himself and his family. But his action that night had consequences far beyond his personal liberation. It struck a blow against the Confederacy that was both practical and symbolic. It provided the Union with valuable assets and intelligence. It challenged assumptions about what black people could achieve. It inspired other enslaved people to seek freedom. It demonstrated to the North that black Americans could be valuable allies in the war. And it planted seeds that would grow into his political career and his decades of civil rights advocacy. One action, one night, ripples extending across years and generations. Perhaps the most important thing Robert Smalls does is hold up a mirror. When we look at his life, we see reflected back both the best and worst of America. The worst, slavery. The brutal system that claimed ownership of human beings. Racism, the ideology that justified that ownership and continues to poison American society. Violence, the tool used to maintain white supremacy before and after emancipation. Betrayal, the abandonment of Reconstruction and the reestablishment of oppression under Jim Crow. Erasure, the deliberate suppression of stories like his that challenge preferred narratives. But also the best. Courage, the willingness to risk everything for freedom. Intelligence, used to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Resilience, the refusal to give up even when progress seems impossible. Service, decades spent working for others rather than just personal gain. Grace, the ability to fight for justice without being consumed by bitterness. And hope, the insistence on believing in a better future even when the present looks dark. Robert Smalls embodies both the tragedy of what America has been and the possibility of what America could be. He represents what was lost to slavery and racism, all the potential that was wasted, all the achievements that never happened because people were held down by an unjust system. But he also represents what's possible when people are given a chance, when talent and intelligence and courage are allowed to flourish, when the barriers are torn down or broken through. The question Robert Smalls' life poses to us is simple but profound. What are we going to do about it? Now that we know his story, now that we understand what he achieved and what it cost him, now that we recognize how his legacy was nearly erased and is only now being recovered, what changes? Does learning about historical injustice make us more committed to fighting present injustice? Does understanding how racism has operated in the past make us better at recognizing how it operates now? Does seeing how one man made a difference inspire us to believe that we can also make a difference? Or do we treat this as just an interesting story, a historical curiosity, something impressive that happened long ago but has no bearing on our lives today? That would be the real tragedy. Not that Robert Smalls' story was nearly forgotten, but that we learn it and then do nothing with that knowledge. He didn't steal the planter just to escape. He could have tried to escape without taking the ship, could have just fled into the night. But he took the ship because he wanted to strike a blow, wanted to help the Union cause, wanted to make a difference beyond just his personal freedom. He didn't serve in Congress just for personal power or prestige. He could have lived comfortably on his wartime earnings, could have focused solely on his own family's welfare. But he entered politics because he wanted to help build a new South, wanted to create opportunities for other Black Americans, wanted to fight for justice on a larger scale. That's the example he sets. Not just surviving, not just succeeding personally, but using whatever platform you have, whatever abilities you possess, whatever opportunities you get to make things better for others. Robert Smalls' story doesn't have a neat ending because the struggle he was part of isn't finished. He won his freedom. He helped win the war. He served his community faithfully. But the world he fought to create, a world of true equality and justice, still doesn't fully exist. We're closer now than in 1915 when he died. The civil rights movement of the 1960s achieved victories he didn't live to see. Legal segregation was dismantled. Voting rights were protected, at least for a while. Opportunities expanded, but structural racism persists. Inequality remains. The fight continues. So his story isn't history in the sense of being over and done with. It's history that's still unfolding, still relevant, still teaching us if we're willing to learn. Every generation has to decide whether to advance the cause of justice or let it stagnate or retreat. Every individual has to decide whether to be part of the solution or part of the problem, or just a passive bystander. Robert Smalls made his choice. He chose to fight, to resist, to never accept injustice as permanent. He chose courage over safety, action over acceptance, hope over despair. He chose to believe that one person could make a difference, and then he spent his entire life proving that belief was justified. The question is, what will we choose? Will we remember his story and let it inspire us? Will we teach it to the next generation? Will we use it as a lens to examine our own society, our own assumptions, our own responsibilities? Will we honor his legacy by continuing the fight he began? The Confederate ship Robert Smalls stole is long gone, scrapped decades ago. The fortifications he passed are tourist attractions now. The political offices he held have been occupied by countless others since his death. But the principles he stood for, the courage he demonstrated, the vision of justice he pursued, those are eternal. And they're ours to carry forward if we choose to accept the responsibility. That's what Robert Smalls really did on that May night in 1862. He didn't just steal a ship. He stole a future that the Confederacy insisted was impossible for him. And then he spent the rest of his life proving that he had every right to that future and fighting to secure it for others. His story isn't just about one remarkable man. It's about the resilience of the human spirit. It's about the power of knowledge and courage. It's about the ongoing struggle for justice. It's about America's complicated past and unfinished work toward a more perfect union. They said a slave could never be trusted with anything of value. Robert Smalls stole a warship, commanded it in combat, and served in Congress. They said black people were inferior, incapable of leadership. He proved them wrong so thoroughly that they had to erase his story to maintain their lies. But the story survived, and now it's ours to tell, to remember, to learn from, and to build upon. If this story moved you, if Robert Smalls' courage reminds you that one person can change history, if his intelligence and strategic thinking inspire you to see that oppression can be resisted and defeated, then share it. Tell others. Make sure his name doesn't fade again into obscurity. Make sure the next generation knows about the man who was born enslaved and became a war hero, a congressman, a legend. Tell it to young people who need to know that barriers can be broken, that systems of oppression have weaknesses, that knowledge is power and courage matters. Tell it to anyone who thinks the fight for justice is hopeless, that one person can't make a difference, that the powerful can't be challenged. Robert Smalls proved all of those assumptions wrong. Make sure children growing up today, especially black children who need to see themselves in history's heroes, know about the man who outsmarted the Confederacy, who turned their own weapons against them, who took what was supposed to be impossible and made it look inevitable, and make sure they know that his fight didn't end with his escape, that he spent decades working for justice, that he saw progress and setback, that he kept fighting anyway. And if you want to hear more stories of people who refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them, people who changed history through courage and intelligence, people whose stories challenge everything we thought we knew about the past, make sure to subscribe. History is full of heroes who've been forgotten, whose achievements have been buried, whose legacies deserve to be recovered and celebrated. Heroes like Robert Smalls, who showed us that freedom isn't given, it's taken. That justice requires fighting for, generation after generation. That one person with knowledge, courage, and determination can indeed change the world. That excellence is the ultimate answer to prejudice. That human dignity can't be destroyed by oppression, only suppressed, waiting for the moment when it can break free. Robert Smalls steamed the CSS Planter past Fort Sumter in 1862. He died in 1915, but his legacy sails on, carried forward by everyone who believes that freedom matters, that justice is worth fighting for, that courage can overcome fear, that knowledge can defeat ignorance, that one person's action can ripple out across generations. The ship he stole is gone. The Confederacy he fought against was defeated. The Congress he served in has changed countless times. But the principles he embodied, courage, intelligence, persistence, grace under pressure, commitment to justice, those are timeless. And they're waiting for each new generation to pick them up and carry them forward. Robert Smalls did his part. He lived a life that mattered, that changed history, that proved what was possible. Now it's our turn to remember his story, to learn from his example, to continue his fight, to build the world he envisioned but didn't live to see. The question isn't whether one person can make a difference? Robert Smalls answered that question on a May night in 1862 when he sailed a stolen Confederate warship to freedom. The question is, will we